What if the Salem Witch Trials weren't about witches at all? What if the images we imagine, children crying out, women dragged in chains, and grim-faced ministers invoking the devil, were only the surface of something far more human and far more disturbing? For centuries, we've told the story of Salem as if the village went mad in a storm of superstition. But behind the screams, behind the prayers, and behind the swinging ropes on Gallows Hill, there were struggles over power, over land, and over who would control the very soul of the community. Fear of witches was real, but what if that fear was used? Used by families to remove rivals, by authorities to keep order, by neighbors to settle scores. The tragedy of Salem was not that people believed in witches. The tragedy was that belief was turned into a weapon. So tonight, we'll pull back the curtain on 1692, on a small Puritan settlement tearing itself apart, and ask the unsettling question: who truly benefited from the hysteria, and why did ordinary people become willing to sacrifice their neighbors in the name of God? Before the first accusation was ever spoken, Salem was already a place under enormous pressure. To understand why hysteria could erupt there, we have to step back into the daily life of a Puritan villager. Salem Village was not Salem Town. Salem Town was wealthy, thriving on Atlantic trade, full of ships, merchants, and worldly goods. Salem Village, just a few miles away, was poor, rural, and deeply religious. Families there struggled to make a living from rocky soil, working long hours just to survive. Winters were harsh, harvests uncertain, and hunger was a constant fear. The memory of war haunted the village. Many families had fled violence on the frontier, especially from brutal conflicts with the Wabanaki during King Philip's War and later attacks in Maine. Children in Salem had grown up watching their neighbors slaughtered or carried off, and those memories colored everything. Imagine living in a world where at any moment your town might burn, where a raid might kill your parents, where starvation was never far away. That fear lived in Salem's bones. And then there was religion. Puritans saw the world as a battlefield between God and Satan. Every cough, every crop failure, every strange dream could be read as a sign that the devil was near. Theirs was a religion that demanded constant vigilance and absolute conformity. A single sinner could bring God's wrath upon the entire community. That meant everyone watched everyone else, because your neighbor's sins could be your doom. On top of this, politics threw Salem into instability. The colony of Massachusetts Bay had lost its charter in 1684, stripping the Puritans of much of their authority. When a new charter arrived in 1691, it diluted the power of the Puritan elite, allowing more royal oversight and greater religious tolerance. For men like Reverend Parris and his supporters, this was terrifying. Their world, their authority, their certainty was under siege, and within Salem Village itself, divisions cut deep. Some families wanted independence from Salem Town and its worldly ways, while others embraced the opportunities that trade and prosperity offered. These disputes were not abstract. They were bitter, personal, tied to who controlled the church, who held the land, and who commanded respect. By 1692, Salem was a pressure cooker, poor, traumatized, deeply religious, politically unstable, and divided against itself. All it needed was a spark. That spark came in the most unsettling place imaginable, the home of Reverend Samuel Parris, the minister whose authority already divided the village. In the dead of winter, his daughter Betty, just 9 years old, and his niece Abigail, 11, began to suffer from bizarre, terrifying fits. They screamed uncontrollably, threw things across the room, twisted their bodies in impossible shapes, and shouted about invisible tormentors clawing at them. Soon, other girls joined in. Anne Putnam Jr., Mercy Lewis, Mary Walcott. The fits grew louder, stranger, more theatrical. Witnesses described them barking like dogs, writhing on the floor, shrieking in voices not their own. In a Puritan household, where children were expected to be silent, obedient, and restrained, this was not just disturbing, it was unthinkable. A doctor examined them but could find no explanation. The conclusion, obvious to the community, was that the devil's hand was upon them. Ministers preached about Satan's assault, and the village waited for answers. Who was doing this to the girls? The children were pressed to speak, and soon the accusations tumbled out. But before we look at who they named, let's pause to ask a question historians have debated for centuries. What really caused the fits? Some have argued it was ergot poisoning from moldy rye, which can cause hallucinations and convulsions. Others suggest mass hysteria, born from the trauma of frontier war and the suffocating repression of Puritan life. Still others believe the girls may have discovered, perhaps unconsciously, that their behavior gave them power in a society where children, especially young girls, were supposed to be voiceless. Whatever the explanation, the result was the same. A community already primed for fear now had living proof that Satan was active in Salem. And once the question was asked, who had unleashed this evil? The path to disaster opened wide. When the girls began to name their tormentors, the pattern was clear. They pointed to three women who stood on the margins of Salem society. The first was Tituba, Reverend Parris's enslaved servant, of indigenous and African descent, whose difference of skin color, culture, and language already marked her as alien in Puritan eyes. The second was Sarah Good, a destitute beggar who lived off the charity of others, known for muttering angrily under her breath when turned away. The third was Sarah Osborne, a woman who had scandalized the village by defying social norms, attempting to claim control over her late husband's property instead of leaving it to male relatives. These women were outsiders in every sense, racially, socially, economically, and morally in the eyes of the Puritans. Their vulnerability made them ideal scapegoats. When brought before magistrates, all denied the charges. But Tituba, under intense interrogation, likely beaten and coerced, gave a confession that electrified the community. She described witches gathering in the woods, spectral animals, figures flying through the air. She painted vivid images of a satanic conspiracy right in Salem's midst. Whether she invented this story to save herself or repeated what she thought her interrogators wanted to hear, her words spread like wildfire. Suddenly, the devil's work was not only real, but organized, hidden in plain sight among neighbors. Fear turned to frenzy. If witches could be in your own village, how could anyone be trusted? The accusations began to multiply. And once the first outsiders were condemned, suspicion spread inward to more respected members of the community. To understand why the hysteria didn't stop with outsiders, we must look beneath the surface at Salem's rivalries. The witch trials were not random. They followed the fault lines of family feuds and property disputes that had festered for decades. Salem Village was dominated by two powerful families, the Putnams and the Porters. The Putnams supported Reverend Parris and stood for keeping Salem Village religious, strict, and separate from the mercantile influences of Salem town. The Porters, wealthier and more worldly, favored closer ties to Salem town and its trade. These weren't abstract positions. They were questions of who would control the village church, who would hold political influence, and who would profit from land and commerce. The witch hysteria gave one faction a devastating weapon. Many of the accused happened to be people aligned with the Porters, or neighbors who had crossed the Putnams in disputes over boundaries, inheritance, or debts. Ann Putnam Jr., just 12 years old, became one of the most prolific accusers, naming dozens of people. But her words carried the weight of her family's ambitions. When accusations landed on wealthy landowners, their property could be seized or sold cheaply. Some of that land ended up in the hands of the accusers' families. Old grudges were settled under the cloak of religious fervor. In this light, the trials were not just a story of panic. They were a story of strategy. Fear was real, yes, but fear was also useful. And when the opportunity came, Salem's feuds and ambitions burned hotter than its piety. By May of 1692, accusations had overwhelmed the local magistrates. The colony responded by creating a special court, the Court of Oyer and Terminer, empowered to handle the crisis. But instead of restoring order, the court became a theater where hysteria played out in deadly earnest. The judges allowed spectral evidence, claims that someone's spirit had tormented the afflicted, even if the accused was nowhere near. In effect, dreams and visions were treated as fact. Imagine standing in that courtroom as young girls collapsed into convulsions, shrieking that your invisible ghost was pinching them. No proof was needed beyond their screams. Neighbors and family members testified against one another, dredging up petty conflicts that suddenly became evidence of satanic plots. If you denied the charges, you risked execution. If you confessed, even falsely, you might be spared, but forever marked as a witch. The trials were designed to produce guilt, not justice. Spectacle fueled the process. Villagers crowded the court, watching the afflicted cry out, claw at invisible specters, and writhe in terror. Their performances were so persuasive that even skeptical observers doubted their own eyes. Could dozens of children really be lying? And above it all, the judges, respected men of the colony, nodded gravely, affirming that this was the devil's work. Fear became law. The machinery of justice, meant to protect the innocent, had been weaponized to destroy them. The summer of 1692 was a season of death. 19 people were executed by hanging on Gallows Hill, 14 women, 5 men. Some were poor, but others were pillars of the community, respected church members, midwives, even former officials. Their only crime was being named. The executions were public, grim reminders of what happened to those who resisted. Families watched mothers and fathers dragged away, never to return. But perhaps the most haunting story is that of Giles Corey. Accused of witchcraft, he refused to enter a plea. He knew that if he pled guilty or not guilty, the court would confiscate his land, leaving his children destitute. So he stayed silent. For that defiance, he was pressed to death under heavy stones, a punishment meant to force a plea. Witnesses said he endured for days, his body crushed, until he finally died. His last words, according to legend, were "more weight." Salem also saw absurdity turn lethal. Even dogs were killed as supposed servants of witches. The accusations spiraled so far out of control that no one was safe. Ministers' wives, wealthy merchants, even children were accused. And yet the machinery ground on, fueled by fear, by grudges, and by a community too terrified to stop it. But the more it consumed, the weaker it became. When accusations finally reached people close to the governor himself, the trials began to collapse under their own weight. By early 1693, the hysteria was unraveling. Governor William Phips, faced with accusations against members of his own household and alarmed at the chaos, dissolved the Court of Oyer and Termina. A new court was formed, one that rejected spectral evidence, and quickly the tide turned. Most remaining prisoners were freed, though many had already languished for months in cold, disease-ridden jails. But the reckoning was only beginning. Judges and jurors expressed public regret. Reverend Samuel Sewall stood in front of his congregation, bowed his head, and confessed his guilt, begging for God's mercy. Ann Putnam Jr., years later, issued a written apology for her role as an accuser, saying she had been deceived by Satan. The colony itself passed acts restoring the rights and reputations of the condemned, and decades later, compensation was offered to their families. Yet no apology could undo the deaths, the shattered lives, the scars on Salem's name. The legacy of 1692 has endured because it warns us of something larger than itself. It shows how fear can eclipse reason, how justice can be corrupted, and how belief, sincere or exploited, can destroy communities. Salem was never only about witches. It was about power, rivalry, vengeance, and the human tendency to turn on one another when fear clouds judgment. And that is why Salem still speaks to us today. Because every society, in moments of crisis, faces the temptation to let fear override fairness, to trade justice for security, to weaponize belief against enemies. The Puritans thought they were defending God's truth. Instead, they destroyed their own. So what do you think? Were the Salem witch trials truly the product of mass hysteria, or were they carefully manipulated by those with the most to gain? What did you think about today's video? Comment your thoughts and suggestions for my next video below.